No matter how good your carefully curated music collection may be, sometimes you find yourself wanting something new to throw into the mix, right? And while many people may start looking for something different to listen to in the current and newly released scene, I often enjoy digging into the past more, trying to find hidden treasures. Think about it. There's no big corporation marketing machine trying to push something onto you. Instead, you're more likely to find hidden gems via word of mouth or, God forbid, doing a little bit of research. And no matter what your favorite entertainment is, from film or video games to music or books, you're dealing with something called the canon. This is an idea that is rooted in religious texts, but is also applied to literature and even music. But basically, it means that some group of people, somewhere, decided what is worth preserving and how you should spend your precious time. One of the best examples of this in music is probably Rolling Stone magazine's cultivated lists of the greatest albums of all time. It's kind of a fun idea, but I can usually guess most of the albums that will be on the lists. So I'm going to offer something a little different and not so official. Just think of it as a suggestion from someone who has listened to a whole lot of music, and today's offering is none other than Porcupine by Echo and the Bunnymen. But before we continue, let me talk to you about today's sponsor, Audible. Audible is a subscription-based service for audiobooks where you can find a wide range of titles from new releases to bestseller classics for you to listen to on any of your devices. If you like Echo and the Bunnymen, Bunnyman, written and narrated by the band's Will Sargent, is available for a free trial using the link in the description below. In the book, Will not only takes a deep dive into his early career as Echo and the Bunnymen's guitarist and co-founder, but also talks about the hectic lifestyle of growing up in Liverpool in the 70s during the punk era. For those that enjoy content like this video and never have listened to audiobooks before, I encourage you to give it a try. I find they are a great thing to listen to while I'm doing other things that don't require my complete focus and still learn a few interesting things. It's free for a month, and you can cancel at any time. Again, use the link on the video description below to claim your free trial and download your first audiobook. Now back to the Bunnymen. First, I want to talk a little bit about the band itself. And I know what you're thinking. It sounds like some furry fetish group that talks in whispers and won't make eye contact with strangers, right? In fact, back when public libraries used to have actual media like CDs, DVDs, and books, I can remember borrowing an Echo and the Bunnymen album from my local library, and the lady working the checkout counter said, "The Bunnymen, huh?" Fair enough. It is a weird name after all. But what about that Echo part? What is that about? Well, if my memory serves me correctly, when the band first started out, they didn't have a drummer yet and used a drum machine that they called Echo. And although they had a drummer for the band by the time they started releasing music, they left the Echo part in the name of the band. And I think that's kind of a cool piece of trivia. It definitely makes the name pop more than if it was simply the Bunnymen. Now, I don't remember if I read about the band first and then checked out their music, or if I just saw the name and packaging and it intrigued me enough to check them out. So although it's a strange name, you have to admit that it kind of gets your attention, doesn't it? So as far as the history and geography of the band go, it was a group from Liverpool, England. You know, the place where the most famous of British bands, the Beatles, came from. Now, that's not to say that Echo and the Bunnymen were on the level of the Beatles. However, just like the Beatles, they did occasionally find themselves in the same pitfall as the Fab Four, because just as boat anchors of songs like Piggies or Honey Pie that dragged down otherwise great albums for the Beatles, Echo and Bunnymen had a few misses too, such as Happy Death Men or a horrible cover of Soul Kitchen by the Doors. And chronologically, they were well past the Beatles, going from roughly 1978 to the present, although as far as releasing albums, their output went from 1980 to 2014, with a couple of new songs in 2018. So while they are technically still around today, there are only 2 members at this point, and I'm not sure if I would really agree that they are more than a touring act these days. Now, if you don't know the band, or maybe have heard some of their songs without knowing what band performed them, you may be asking yourself by now, what exactly does a Bunnyman sound like? The short answer is that a Bunnyman sounds like post-punk music with maybe a little extra polish as the years went on. They definitely had some poppy moments too that remind me of some of U2's music. But before you start thinking of them as the poor man's U2, I want to make it perfectly clear that I prefer Echo and the Bunnymen over Bono and the Irishmen. But that's just my personal opinion, and is probably because I don't like music that is too overproduced, if you know what I'm saying. I like a little bit of grit and experimentation that doesn't come across as pretentious in the way that U2 sometimes does. There, I said it, U2 can be pretentious. But it's time to get back to our main subject. Now, as far as songs that you may know by this band, some of their more popular tracks in the USA are Bring on the Dancing Horses, The Killing Moon, and Lips of Sugar. And I know some of their music sometimes popped up in film soundtracks such as Pretty in Pink, The Lost Boys, and a little more recently in the freaky movie Donnie Darko. Now, those songs are commonly associated with the band in the 1980s, and it would be easy to guess when they were released. But their Porcupine album is the one that I think you should hear at least once in your lifetime. So let's take a closer look. Porcupine was released a lifetime ago in 1983, and as soon as I mention the year, you're probably already forming an idea of what it probably sounds like in your mind. Am I right? But here's the thing about this album. If someone played this album for me for the first time and then asked me to guess which decade it was released in from the 1980s to the 2020s, so a total of 5 decade choices, I don't know if I would be able to guess it correctly. Basically, if you told me that it came out last year, I would probably believe you, because it's not something like Flock of Seagulls or early Depeche Mode that sounds really dated. It's just its own special thing, and it has an interesting sound that I've never heard done quite the same way anywhere else. It was the band's 3rd overall album, so they had already had a little time to mature, and I think it's the best of their work. But I never hear or see people talking about it in real life or on the internet, and maybe that needs to change at least a bit, especially for people who enjoy finding new, older stuff to sink their teeth into. This album clocks in at a cool 45 minutes. Remember that this was back when albums were released on vinyl records, so the time was shorter than for compact discs or cassette tapes, and it was actually quite successful in the United Kingdom when it came out. But while some of the songs work as radio-friendly hits, this is certainly not a pop album, a pop rock album, or even a ballad record. Even if you have some experience composing music and you know some popular chord progressions and how to use a verse-chorus, bridge song structure, could you write this album? You can get back to me on that after you hear it. I know I couldn't write this album, and that's part of what fascinates me about it. And it's not just the combination of instruments. It's basically drums, 2 guitars, bass, and vocals with some strings added in. But there's more to it than that. Actually, the band's label, WEA, didn't like their first recording of the album and had them redo it with strings by an Indian musician named L. Shankar, who is no relation to the famous Ravi Shankar as far as I know. Now, I would be curious to hear that first recording, but artistic freedom is damned. I definitely believe that the record company made the right call here because the strings give the songs a unique flavor and fullness that just guitar, bass, and drums can rarely achieve on their own. I really can't stress that point enough. The strings really push these songs to the next level, which is why I consider it head and shoulders above Echo and the Bunnymen's other work. As far as the singles for the album, there were 2. Which were also the first tracks on the LP, The Cutter and The Back of Love. But in my opinion, 2 other songs, namely Clay and Heads Will Roll, could just as easily have been singles as well. The remainder of the songs isn't quite as accessible as these 4 are, generally having slower tempos and more relaxed vocal styles. But don't think for a second that I'm saying that the other songs are bad. I mean, we're all adults here, right? To clarify, the key word here is accessible, by which I mean you may have to listen to the album a few times to really gain an appreciation for them. And there's nothing wrong with songs that grow on you like an acquired taste. After all, this isn't a greatest hits album, for God's sake. So I think now it's time to take a closer look at a select few of the 10 tracks that make up the album and see what they bring to the table. Track 1. The Cutter. This song kicks off the album with a bang, because the intro melody seems to have a slightly odd time signature, and it's almost discordant too, but in a very catchy way that I really enjoy. As for the vocals, there is an immediate urgency and franticness in the tone and delivery as singer Ian McCulloch asks to be spared of the cutter because he can't cut the mustard. And in case you're wondering, cutting the mustard is a way of saying being able to meet expectations or being able to hack it. The bass line is hypnotic but dynamic. The guitar complements it nicely, and those strings are pure gold. If you're listening to this track, I think by now you should be able to hear what I mean about how hard it would be to write a song like this. And when all of the parts of the song are firing on all cylinders and the track is in full swing, it's just magic. Track 2. The Back of Love. The second track of Porcupine was also a single but was released prior to the album, and it keeps the momentum going right from the get-go with its choppy staccato guitar riff. Hey, I never said that this was an album to relax to, so there is admittedly some of the disillusionment with life that could be found in the music of the 1980s, but again, this doesn't sound like your typical 80s stuff. And while the pacing is quick, there are some cool breakdown parts with layered vocals added to the song to change things up. Seriously, during the garage rock revival at the turn of the millennium, when bands like The Strokes, The White Stripes, and The Hives were popular, any one of those bands could have been proud of a song like this. Track 8. Higher Hell. If you really dig the first two tracks, do not miss out on Clay and Heads Will Roll. But at this point, I think it's time to explore one of the slower songs that makes up the second half of the album. It may not be as exciting, but variety is the spice of life, as they say, and I always appreciate albums that take the listener on a musical journey, if that makes sense. I mean, sometimes albums that just have a bunch of 3-minute songs that all use the same tempo can end up being kind of boring or even exhausting to listen to all the way through. And this dirge-like song in particular seems to deal with the duality that exists in all of us, with lyrics about the singer's lower heaven and higher hell, a lyrical twist that I've always liked. And I also highlighted this track because for me it evokes a feeling of coldness that reminds me of the frigid landscape that the band is traversing on the album's cover. So by now, you should have a pretty good idea of whether Porcupine floats your boat, but I do think you should listen to it all the way through at least once. After all, this is from a time period before the internet, when most music wasn't available to stream or listen to on demand. And back then, you had to invest your money in an actual album, which meant that you hopefully listened to it many times to really let it grow on you. Anyway, the album is available these days with many bonus tracks added to it beyond the original 10 songs, and I hope you love it as much as I do.